5, 4, 3, 2, 1. May I now turn to some of the specific issues that have been raised in the course of the debate. A major priority of this country's foreign policy, as indeed the foreign policy of all the countries, is its relationship with its neighboring countries. We are very keen and have always been very keen for having best relations with our neighbors. We have many common aspects. We are one people in many aspects because we have cultural ties and we have economic linkages. And where we do not have economic linkages, we have good reason to have economic linkages in many respects. Therefore, the fraternal spirit that we advocate for the international community as a whole, that fraternal spirit must prevail. Even more humanity in our own neighborhood, in this region, in this subcontinent, and therefore the relations with our neighbors and the strengthening of these relations are of priority in our foreign policy objectives. We look at the relationship with our neighbors from two planes. One is the multilateral plane, and that is basically through the regional arrangement of SAARC, and the other is of course the bilateral plane. As far as the SAARC is concerned, I would like to submit here that the recent SAARC summit held in Colombo last December, we hope will impart economic content to growing cooperation among the South Asian countries within the SAARC framework. Elevation of poverty has been accorded the highest priority by the summit leaders, who agreed in Colombo to set up an independent South Asian Commission to study and report to the next SAARC summit its recommendations on poverty alleviation in South Asia. With these developments, it is expected that SAARC will be more responsive to the needs and aspirations of the people of South Asia. As far as bilateral relations are concerned, over the last 1 year or so, there has been, by and large, generally speaking, a substantial upswing in these relations. I could mention, for instance, Indo-Nepal relations. In the course of last 1 year, and indeed more than 1 year, Indo-Nepal relations have not merely been normalized, but in the recent past have been strengthened and intensified. During the Nepalese Prime Minister's visit to India in December 2001, substantial progress was made in identifying concrete areas and mechanisms for mutually beneficial bilateral cooperation between India and Nepal. As many as 5 treaties and agreements were signed between the two countries for cooperation in a large number of areas, such as trade, transit, control of unauthorized trade, agricultural, education, science and technology. A number of decisions were taken for cooperation in the key of area of water resources development. Thus, the two countries are moving toward a new era of mutually beneficial bilateral cooperation. In short, I may say that our relations with Nepal are at a splendid high level, and perhaps they have never been as good as they are now. We could indeed improve on this spirit of fraternity and cooperation for further benefit of both our countries and people. As far as Sri Lanka is concerned, the meeting between our Prime Minister and President Premsada in December 2001 on the occasion of the SAARC summit gave a further boost to bilateral relations and enabled discussion of issues of concern. It was agreed that Sri Lanka would take back Tamil refugees presently in India who were desisting of returning voluntarily to their homeland. As of now, approximately 15,000 have returned, and the movement is continuing. We have taken up with the Sri Lanka government incidents of attacks by Sri Lanka Navy on our fishing vessels which stray beyond the maritime boundary. Assurance have been received from them that such instances will not recur. At the same time, it is necessary that our fishermen be advised to confine their fishing activities to the Indian side of the maritime boundaries, and we are at the direction of the Prime Minister. in the process of seeing as to what we can do within the existing legal framework to improve upon the possibility of fishermen to fish in some of these areas which we are now discussing. Now I come to Pakistan. Unfortunately, in spite of our good wishes and in spite of our keen desire, I am not in a position to report to the House that our relations with Pakistan are in a very good condition. The crux of the problem remains Pakistan's continued support to terrorism and subversion directed against the Indian states of Jammu and Kashmir and Punjab. Assurance conveyed by Pakistan in this regard remain to be translated. Pakistan has also been attempting to internationalize the Kashmir issue and has misrepresented and distorted the situation in the valley through false propaganda. At the very outset, I would like to mention that the idea of introducing a compulsory saving schemes is not a new one and has been under consideration for the past several years. In fact, as early as in 1998 to 1999, the National Development Council had expressed a view in its favor. We are also trying to secure the cooperation of trade unions and employers for its introduction. As a result, however, of the situation created by the emergency and the paramount need for finding additional resources to meet the growing cost of development and defense, the government came to the conclusion that it was no longer possible to rely on the proceeds of taxation and voluntary saving alone, that introduction of some elements of compulsory saving was unavoidable. The bill before the House is a comprehensive measure and seeks to cover all the major sections of the community who can be expected to have some margin for savings, however small that might be. It cannot be denied that compulsory savings would impose some hardship, particularly on the lower income groups. No one would have been happier than ourselves if we had the means of eliminating these groups from the scope of compulsory savings. But in our country, by far the major portion of the population is poor, and unless the poorer section are also made to save, we cannot hope to build the country's future prosperity. The opinion of the Attorney General of the constitutional validity of the bill has already been laid on the table of this House. Honorable members may have also seen reports of the discussions in the other House, which have since been circulated to them. I have nothing much to add to these issues except to confirm that, in our view, Parliament is fully competent to legislate on a measure of this type, and that the restrictions which the bill seeks to impose are reasonable restrictions and are in the interest of the general public within the meaning of Article 19 of the Constitution. Government are taking powers to provide for suitable deductions or exemptions wherever they may be justified to ensure that the bill does not impose any undue hardship. The schemes to be drawn up will be laid before Parliament, and honorable members would have full opportunity to suggest whatever modifications that they consider necessary. Considerable opposition has been voiced in regard to the inclusion of persons liable to the payment of land revenue in the scheme of the compulsory savings. It has also been suggested that if it is not possible to exclude this category altogether, a higher exemption limit may be fixed for them. We have very carefully considered these suggestions. May I inform the House that before the bill was drafted, there were detailed discussions with the chief ministers and finance ministers of the states, and the conclusions reached were that in a comprehensive legislation of this type, it would not be appropriate to exclude the rural sector, which has also had its fair share of rising incomes and growth in agricultural production and economy. A very large proportion of investments made by government has been on multi-purpose river valley projects for providing irrigation and electricity facilities. The main benefit from these projects cannot but be assumed to have occurred to the the agricultural classes. On the other hand, land revenue rates have not increased in the same proportion as the other forms of taxations. It should also be borne in mind that on an average the land revenue liability is less than 2% of the total agricultural income, and as such compulsory deposits at about 50% of the land revenue payable at the rates in force in 1999 to 2000 cannot be constructed and as onerous. Although for administrative conveyances the bill provides for the maximum rate of compulsory deposit at 50% of the current land revenue liability, the scheme shall be so devised as to ensure that the deposit does not exceed on the whole 50% of the land revenue payable according to the 1999 to 2000 rates. This is indeed of reduce the extra burden on the landholders in the states where the land revenue rates have been increased in recent years. Nevertheless, with a view to removing the hardship on small landholders, we have agreed to exempt those small holders whose land revenue liability is less than rupees 5,000 annum by making necessary provisions in the scheme to be drawn up. As a result of this exemption, almost half the total land revenue payers would be excluded from the scope of compulsory savings. I might add that some of the less developed states